survey. This government regularly use KPMG to put a spin on whatever they want, and in this case the IFA have done that. But at its very heart, this is hypocrisy for Micheál Martin, because neither he, Fianna Fáil nor Fine Gael have any intention of challenging the big agri-food industry in this country, whether it's Larry Goodman, Dawn Meats or Kerry Co-op, who are the main producers of methane and agricultural emissions. And neither have they the interest at heart of the small family farmer. So I really want to challenge his spin on that, and to say also about his declaration that Ireland will sign up to a declaration to reduce methane by 30%. We sign declarations all the time in this country. That doesn't mean we live up to them. And really this is a cop-out from Micheál Martin at the COP conference. It'll be interesting to see later on how much he challenges the fossil fuel industry. Like most leaders so far, have barely mentioned the fossil fuel industry and have given no commitment to challenging their role in what's happening in terms of the climate catastrophe that we're facing. And so instead we're calling on the government yet again to take measures that really matter. And we'll be marching throughout the country on Saturday. There's a COP26 coalition in line with all global initiatives. We'll be marching on the 6th of November to demand very basic measures from this government. First and foremost, the implementation of free and frequent public transport in order to take cars off the road. Transport is responsible for over 30% of our emissions. And the second thing, we'll be repeating our call to ban any more proliferation of data centres in this country. Mark Zuckerberg might think that he can produce a great meta virtual world for us, but if he thinks for 1 minute that that is going to happen using the Irish grid and using Irish water in order to increase ever more usage of data, then I think the movement really has to demand that that has to stop. And most importantly, we need a declaration from our government that they will ban the importation of LNGs and stop developing any further fossil fuel infrastructure. We'll also be calling for a just transition for the family farmers, for the small farmers who are really being terrified and put upon in terms of the just transition that is required. So this is very important that we see what Micheál Martin is saying purely as spin, and really what he's saying is, Lord, make me good, but not quite yet. Mañana is what this government's commitments are all about, but we need immediate action, and his pronouncements this morning are nothing but spin.
Breed, you mentioned emissions coming from cars, and you mentioned free public transport, but the reality is a lot of people are still going to drive no matter if there's free public transport there or not. Do you think the government needs to incentivise electric cars a little bit more, and if so, what can they do?
Well, the reality isn't that people will continue to drive if there's free and frequent public transport. We've had surveys from countries like Luxembourg, from Slovenia and from Amsterdam that shows that when free public transport is available, it takes probably up to 60% of cars off the road almost immediately. There will obviously be need for people who live in very remote areas to get to towns, villages and transport hubs, but it will absolutely have a major impact straight away.
Might just take Mick now on the call.
So, more than 100,000 people are expected on the streets of Glasgow on Saturday protesting outside the COP conference. I will be there among them. Myself and a group of young Socialist Party members will be travelling by boat and ferry, arriving Thursday and staying for the school strike on the Friday and the huge demonstration on the Saturday before returning on the Sunday. Both myself and the young people will be available for comment before, during and after the protests. We have no faith in the people inside the conference room and the corporate interests that stand behind them. They've had 25 COPs under their belt and we're still heading for 2.7. As Greta Thunberg says rightly, the hope is with the people who are on the streets and the young people who are fighting for change. Just briefly in relation to Micheál Martin this morning, the Irish government delegation have trotted off to Glasgow, waving high in the air their climate action plans. It's a sham. And the sham is shown by the fact that Micheál Martin is signing an agreement today for 30% cuts in methane. He'll be there, signing in front of the TV cameras, but on the ground, you guys, the Irish media, are being told this is a global deal. It's not going to apply 30% nationally. When Ireland is the fourth biggest emitter of methane from its agriculture in the world. All right? An Irish government that was serious about climate change would cut methane emissions in this country by 30%. And if that means, and it would, taking on the profits of the agribusiness industry and the big dairy farmers, then so be it. Okay?
Yeah, just before I talk about schools, just one word on the government's proposal, which was kind of semi-announced or leaked yesterday in terms of bank holidays, whereby the government previously, flew the kite of giving workers who had sacrificed so much a bank holiday in recognition of that sacrifice during COVID. But what is currently being discussed is about the meanest way possible to introduce a bank holiday. So they're talking about one bank holiday for 1 year for everything that workers have been through, in the context when Ireland is one of the lowest in the EU in terms of the number of bank holidays that we have. It's really, really disgraceful, and People Before Profit will be pushing ahead with our bill to introduce 3 extra bank holidays to bring us up to the European norm. The main point I want to make is in relation to the schools. Whenever the government abandoned contact tracing in schools, we said, and I think we were alone in saying it in the Dáil repeatedly, that this is a policy of hear no evil, see no evil by the government, and that it will come back to bite them. That's precisely what has happened with a crisis for school students, for parents, for families, for communities, and very rapidly rising COVID cases. The government needs to take action now. They need to reinstate contact tracing and testing in the schools immediately. That's the safe, that's the responsible thing to do. And they also need to, a year and a half or more into a pandemic, follow the science in terms of the centrality of ventilation. For example, in Victoria, in Australia, every single classroom now has had a HEPA filter installed. That's a filter that cleans the air, that takes out the particles that contain COVID within them. In Germany, schools can apply up to a maximum grant of €500,000 for each school to install HEPA filters. In this country, there is not one single HEPA filter installed with Department of Education money. The government hasn't prioritised it at all. There isn't even a CO2 monitor in every school across across our country. It's absolutely correct to say that as a society we should prioritise reopening schools, keeping schools open. Absolutely, we agree with that. We don't want the disruption that would come from having to shut schools again. But that means putting the resources in place to actually enable our students and our teachers to go to school safely. So that means reinstating contact tracing and testing, and it means installing HEPA filters and CO2 monitors in every single classroom in the state.
Holding up the rear here with a couple of niche points. Right. First of all, I just want to say that on a particular point about forestry that's been discussed at COP, and I just want to say the Irish government, when it comes to forestry, are really outrageously speaking out of both sides of their mouth. While they're talking in Glasgow about protecting the world's forests as carbon sinks, here in Ireland we are seeing 5 times more trees being cut down every year than are being planted, and that is a consistent pattern, and it is absolutely shocking. So this year so far 22,000 hectares of trees have been licensed for felling, but only 3,500 have been licensed for planting. And that follows a consistent pattern every year for years, where we have spectacularly failed to meet our afforestation targets. And it is a scandal because essentially Coillte is operating to the diktats of the market for timber prices rather than as custodians of the forest estate and expanding the forest estate to deal with the climate and the biodiversity crisis. So I just think that's an important issue that needs to be raised on the particular day that's in it. The other point I just want to make quickly is about student nurses and midwives. The People Before Profit were the first people to bring this issue to Dáil and public attention with our motion in the Dáil last autumn, where we called for the student nurses and midwives to be paid for the work that they are doing on clinical placement, particularly given the heroic work they've done substituting for sick healthcare workers during the COVID crisis. Now, with COVID infections rising, those student nurses and midwives are once again on the front line, putting themselves at risk in order to protect our health services and look after sick and vulnerable patients. And still, nearly 2 years into the pandemic, the government have done nothing to reward those student nurses and midwives for the work they're doing on the front line of our health service. And if there's any lesson surely we have to learn from the COVID crisis, is we have to dramatically expand the capacity of our health service, and that means recruiting and retaining student nurses and midwives when they qualify to work in the public health service. But when you don't pay them, when you treat them despicably, when you take them for granted, as we are currently doing, is it any wonder that more than 70% of student nurses and midwives want to leave the country after they qualify? So we have the talent, we are training the talent in this country to increase the capacity of our health service, but many of those student nurses and midwives leave because of the horrible experience that they have on the wards when they're on placement, not being paid and in fact being charged fees for the privilege of working on the wards looking after sick people. It's absolutely outrageous. So once again we'll be raising the call, as the student nurses and midwives are going to be here protesting today. The government should pay student nurses and midwives properly for their work on placement if we want to recruit and retain the nurses and midwives we need to have a proper functioning health service that can deal both with COVID and with non-COVID healthcare.
Questions?
Richard, do you think
Sorry.
it's coincidental that the news of Stephen Donnelly's, the student nurses and the pay increases, do you think that's just coincidence that it came out when it's being discussed in the Dáil tonight in the protesters outside?
No, it just proves you need people power in order to make this government to do absolutely anything at all. And the important lesson, I think, is for the student nurses and midwives to keep up the fight, not to give up. And the truth is, student nurses and midwives, as many of our health workers, are absolutely exhausted from the work that they have been doing on the front line, and we're really in despair about the refusal of the government to respond to their legitimate calls to be paid for their work on placements. But I think they're absolutely right to protest, and the fact that we're starting to get movement from the Health Minister on this is an indication that protests work, and the student nurses and midwives should keep up their fight until they are rewarded and respected properly for the work they do on the front line of our health service.
Richard, do you think your party's green credentials have been damaged by voting against the cycle track proposed by Dún Laoghaire Rathdown County Council for Dean's Grange?
Now, what our councillors were arguing for is that there should be a proper consultation because you need proper planning on reconfiguration of road networks. And that's what we're arguing for. We absolutely want to see the cycle infrastructure advanced, but we want to see it done in proper consultation with the local community, which did not happen. And you do not bring people with you in terms of climate measures or developing cycle infrastructure if you ride roughshod over local communities. You need to consult and discuss with the local community and deliver that cycle infrastructure in a way that you bring the community with you.
Sorry. Vaccines, I'm not sure if it's Susanna.
Maybe I've said enough, probably, but
Yeah, whoever wants to.
who wants to take vaccines?
So obviously we saw the announcement yesterday that frontline workers will finally get their booster shots. Do you reckon that NIAC have been extremely slow on this, and that maybe it was up to the government to actually step in? Because we knew that frontline workers were going to get their boosters anyway. So do you reckon that it was up to the government to step in and say, do you know what, we're not waiting for NIAC anymore, we're going to roll them out?
Well, I think you need to have NIAC's agreement. You have to do it on a medical and scientific basis. But I think the broader issue here that is still the case is the fact that, you know, most people in the world are still not fully vaccinated. I think it's probably still the case that most people have not had one vaccine, certainly close to 50%. And that is due, just very bluntly, to the big private pharmaceutical companies who received massive public funding to develop these vaccines, sitting on and protecting their intellectual property at the cost of people's lives. And that's what puts people in the situation of having to choose between, okay, frontline workers, vulnerable people, older people, population as a whole in developed world, compared to countries where there's nothing. So we're going to, re-put pressure on the government around the question of the TRIPS waiver, which will come up with the WTO again, and which the Irish government has played a really shameful role, together with the EU, in just acting as the instrument of the pharmaceutical companies. All sorts of excuses trotted out, but that's the central question, particularly in a context whereby it looks like, COVID may be a thing whereby we have regular booster vaccines for an extended period of time. You're talking huge profits being made by these pharmaceutical companies, and we need to end their intellectual property on these vaccines so that people can have access to it. That's the central answer, and that allows everybody who needs them to get access to them.
Sorry, Mick, just on COP26, you were saying basically the Irish plan, if I recall correctly, is a sham and the Irish government isn't doing enough. We've a post from the Sun Times from this week, basically from Brian O'Gallagher, professor of energy engineer at UCC. He said Ireland has a good news stories to bring, particularly for the short term, because its ambitions for the next 10 years is the second highest in the world. Denmark is the only country that's higher. So if the Irish plan is a sham, are we really screwed as a world?
Well, the quote that you give is quite instructive, because what is being said there is that there's great plans for the next 10 years, okay? But look at the reality on the ground now of what is happening. And even look at what's happening today in relation to the COP26 deal on methane. Ireland is signing up, 30%. But then, sotto voce, the Taoiseach says that's a global agreement we're agreeing to there. We're agreeing to assist with global 30% cuts. But nationally, that's a different story. And the reason he's saying that is because he's protecting the interests, not of the small farmers and the medium-sized farmers, but the big dairy farmers and agribusiness. Ireland has the 4th highest emissions in the world for its agriculture in terms of methane. All right? There needs to be an Irish government that stands up and says, we will cut methane by 30% and we'll take on the vested interests that are necessary to be taken on in order to do that. So it's one thing to go to Glasgow waving high above your heads, this is what we're going to do in the next 9 years. All right? I'm not saying that that's nothing, but we've got to also measure about what's being done now in reality on the ground. I asked my staff to check into that this morning. It must be per capita, but I haven't got the answer yet. But anyway, it's up there, Paul.